Hello and welcome to Intro to Theater class again. Hope everybody's doing well. Today we are going to be covering the topic of musical theater. I will send up follow up links so you can look at musicals on the web and the internet. Okay, so we're going to do 15 minutes. There'll be two parts to the music theater section. This is going to get us going here today. Again, I hope everybody's doing well. Your job will be this week to view both of these lectures and to take your notes on them. And then on Monday, we will have a quiz on musical theater. I will follow up by tomorrow in details of how that will proceed. Okay, the musical. As we look at the musical, it is something that's relatively new when we're looking at the historical arts. But if we look at history, the musical as we know it today, Broadway live musical theater, was not really an active activity or presentation that was happening on stage. This here is an example of some of the different types of theatrical performances, which are different from plays, that were kind of in that realm of the musical. And what's important about the musical here is that just like baseball and apple pie, the musical came from the United States. And that's very important to note because the first musical occurred here in the United States, which is rare. When we look at operas, we get that from Italy. We look at ballet, we get that from the French. And a lot of the older historically European countries, which are far thousands and thousands of years older than we are here, they were established and their arts were established. So the musical was born out of this country, and we'll get to that. Some of the examples in history, as we're looking at some ideas of what could have led up to what a musical is important to note. And here's a couple of the terms here. Ballad operas were operas or smaller type of operas where the writer borrowed popular songs of the day and rewrote the lyrics. Now the term popular is important because musical theater is really an art that tied our pop culture to the historical or liturgical process of the art of theater performances. Comic operas were original scores, which is original music, using romantic plot lines. In addition to these, we had what we've talked about already, vaudeville, which were variety shows which incorporated singing and music with piano, some dancing. Music hall was kind of the same as vaudeville, but music hall was from the British, and that was what they called it, was music hall. Melodramas were plays that had moments where music was underscoring it. There may have been some small singing or talking within it, but it really didn't fit our definition of musical, which we'll give here in just a minute. And then, of course, burlesque shows, of course, as you remember, were like vaudeville shows, but they were more risque, raunchy, etc., something that you didn't take the family to. So let's look at the development of the modern musical. So when everyone talks about musical theater or Broadway or theater, it is musical theater that is on Broadway, and it's in New York. When someone says, "Ooh, you do theater," then the first thing they say is, "Oh, so you're going to go to Broadway." Well, our connection of our non-theater educated culture at times is mainly Broadway theater. Well, 90% of Broadway is musical theater. So we tend to know a little bit more about that. But the reason why the musical is important, and its reason is one of the main reasons, is because of the fact that it incorporates all of these elements for the theater performance. Now, what you're looking at here is how the first musical came to be. And it was a piece that was kind of a mixture of French dancers and American singers who both were stuck in New York. And they had time where they had to wait before they could leave and move on to their next performance or activity after that. And being stuck in New York, they had a few weeks together and apparently had time on their hands because they came together and they created a stage piece. They created kind of a musical play. And this play incorporated the elements of what we know to be as the modern musical. It occurred in 1866 in New York, and it was called The Black Crook. And when we're talking about the description of what a musical is, it is when dancing, singing, and acting all three come together to move the same storyline from beginning, middle to end. Now, the differences between that definition and what we know in the vaudeville circuit or kind of variety or musical type of examples I gave you before was that those were small little snippets and small little music pieces, songs that were put together to do that. So because this happened in 1866 and because it happened in New York, it was credited with being known as the first musical when we look back at that. So given that fact, it was born in New York. Therefore, New York and the United States was credited with putting together and presenting the first musical as we know it today. Now, important to note also is musical theater in the Golden Age, when it really started to kick in, didn't happen shortly hereafter. In fact, it was after the turn of the century, in the late 30s, where we start to see a whole slew of musical theater come together. So other activities happen going into the early 1900s that were kind of the gap between 1866, the first musical, going into our what we call the Golden Age. So in comparison, opera had something called an operetta, which was a smaller sort of type of opera. Operas were very large in scale. They were several hours long. You got usually one weekend of performances. You could literally be sitting in a theater for 5 to 6 hours with a couple of intermissions, and the performers were not on the stage 8 times a week like they are in Broadway. However, operettas were kind of smaller sorts of opera scenes that had upbeat comedy to it. They were shorter and lighter in content as opposed to the big grand opera that we sort of know of today, or reminisce in its historical nature of today. So the operetta is kind of close to the musical, but the elements of musical, as we'll see in here in a minute, are going to be different as well. Operas were really focused on the sound of the musical instrument of the voice. Okay, so we did have operettas, yet they were not musicals. So more intro into that. So let's take us into the 1900s. As we get into the 20s, we're coming into the jazz age. We have big bands. We have a lot of this roaring 20s music movement that's happening. So the musical, as far as the musical theater as we know it today, had not really caught on. Then, of course, we have motion pictures that have already gone into swing. Of course, at the beginning, they were not what we call talkies. They were silent films. And so we were only able to see images and not really hear things. And you can Google some of those and check those out. They're pretty interesting. So we have a lot of things happening. As you notice, motion pictures would fall in kind of our technology category. And we'll also see how technology has affected the birth or the growth of musical theater and how it affects theater altogether. Because technology typically always dictates and changes our society. And that's not so different either with the silent movies and then later the talking ones. So the idea of bands performing popular music and things of that nature were occurring, which really did get things moving along and would eventually come together with musicals. But then, of course, we had the Great War, World War I, that occurred in the late teens, in the middle teens, late teens, and that really kind of brought things to a stopping point. We also had, of course, going into the 20s, with the Roaring Twenties, with the music halls, the vaudeville, that was still a very popular thing happening, and a lot of those stars were kind of journeying over to the non-talking movies at this time. And then, of course, right before things probably were going to shift to musical theater, we're still in reviews, we have the stock market crash in 1929, and then, of course, that kicks off the Great Depression. So the Great Depression is important in this because it was the response from the government for the Great Depression that really got things going as far as getting theater all over the country. The Great Depression affected theater audiences on all sides of the whole country, as well as in Europe. People had no money. They really had no money to spend on entertainment, and it was an exciting time because it really helped in the development and the growth and the popularity of theater and musical theater. The musical had finally evolved beyond gags and showgirls and musicals of the gay 90s and the roaring 20s, and so only few people were allowed to explore this in the Great Depression, and obviously the jobs for the performers were few and far between, and unfortunately that may be what we're seeing right now with our events today. So this moves us to the answer to the Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president at the time, who took us all the way through, almost completely through World War II, but he was president also during the Great Depression, as you look back at your history and reflect on that. But he did create something called the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, or Works Projects Administration. Two of those terms go back and forth, but the WPA came out of his instigation of a stimulus package known as the New Deal. So you probably are familiar with the New Deal from your study in history. We're experiencing that today with the issues with this virus. We're working on stimulus packages to try to reinvigorate the economy. In the New Deal, out of the New Deal, created these projects for not only trades workers, but also folks that were involved in the arts. The Federal Theater Project was one of those. They had the Federal Dancers Project, Federal Poets, Federal Writers Project, and others. But the Federal Theater Project affected where theaters were located, and eventually caused the spread of professional and non-professional theater throughout the U.S. So when we look at the WPA, it took place from 39 to 43, and I believe it was 34 to 35, because the Federal Theater Project didn't only last no more than a year. But this is kind of an explanation of what the WPA was and how it was able to help people work and start working and get involved in doing the things that they needed to do in order to survive. This did do a lot. We have buildings all over the country now. You'll look in the corner block, it'll say WPA. So whenever you see a building that has WPA, or this was a project of WPA, that came out of that stimulus package. Under this was the Federal Theater Project. What this did was it caused them to build and build and build, and under the WPA FTP, they were building theaters all over the country in order to create work, so that the government, it's basically the government taking your tax money, investing it in projects all over the country so that workers in the country can have a place to work. So it can work for a little bit, but it's not very long term. It's very cyclical. So what it did was we're building theaters all over the country. And in doing so, it established buildings and places all over the country. What that did today was it allows professional theater, including musical theater, to be established all over the country. Okay, and so each of these became little theaters, community theaters, or professional theaters after the Federal Theater Project was finished, which I believe was 1935. So it's important to know that if you don't know that about your history, also in relationship to what we're dealing with today with this coronavirus and the stimulus that happens there. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and let this finish off part one. I want you to go back and look at the email that I'm going to send you along with this that will have an attachment of links to different musicals on the Tony Awards, so you can kind of saturate yourself in what musical is. The musical really revolves around popular music and is different than that big, large opera. And in part two, which will follow this, it will give you more details, and I'll have more terms to help you understand and define what musical theater is. So this will conclude part one for our lecture on musical theater. I'm doing 15 minutes at a time. Make sure you go through this and get your notes not only from what you see on the screen, but what I do mention. It's important to understand some of those examples in history and things of that nature. Okay, thank you very much, and I will be back in touch.